Coming up, and the penalty that was paid for trusting the experts, for following the bad advice, for believing that they could predict the future wasn't just worry and heartburn and having to listen to commentators drone on confidently about something of which they knew little. The penalty was much worse. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? You've probably all heard of Nostradamus, the 16th century French physician, astrologer, and prognosticator, whose predictions have become the stuff of legends, endless books, and academic disputes. Many contend he predicted a vast number of major world events, including the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon and Hitler, World War I and World War II, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, and 9/11, to name just a few. We're not going to be engaging in an analysis or debate about the evidence showing that he predicted those events, but rather I simply raise his name as an example of somebody famous for the surprising, even shocking accuracy of his predictions. And I'm using his name to tee up a discussion of the predictions, in this case more appropriately titled Warnings, of someone you might want to refer to as America's President Nostradamus. Now, with that kind of title, you'd think this individual would be brimming with personality, with charisma, the quintessential politician whose spoken word could hold your attention virtually indefinitely. And you'd be very wrong. But given that today is the 4th of July, it's particularly appropriate that I chose this president. Dwight David Eisenhower could get his point across, often very economically in terms of the number of words spoken, but without flash, without charisma. His speeches don't really deserve to be called eloquent, but rather they can be called efficient. And in that respect, given his background as a general, given his role as supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War II, I would expect that he would probably say that's not a criticism of his speaking style, because efficiency is more important than eloquence. Regardless of its eloquence or lack thereof, there is one speech from President Eisenhower which is truly famous, which has stood the test of time, and that speech is his farewell address delivered in 1961. You probably know why it's famous. It's famous because President Eisenhower called out the danger to our republic represented by the power center, for which he coined a new term, the military-industrial complex, the combination of a massive standing military entangled with massive defense contractors concerned Eisenhower. He acknowledged the necessity of a large military to protect our country and the necessity of a large arms industry to supply it, but he warned, quote, "In the councils of government we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist," close quote. And many of us have thought about Eisenhower's warning whenever it seems like we're being propelled into armed conflict overseas in countries that just don't seem like they mean enough to our national security to warrant armed involvement. But few recall, and the media virtually never talks about, the fact that Eisenhower's warnings in his farewell speech didn't stop with the military-industrial complex. He warned about the entanglement of the federal government with scientific research. He warned that government contracts could become, quote, "virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity," close quote. He warned about public policy becoming, quote, "the captive of a scientific, technological elite," close quote. Think about the worshipful attitude of so many towards Dr. Anthony Fauci, Think about the reports of apparent funding from the U.S. for gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Think about the nearly endless list of hyper-specific restrictions of individual and business conduct in response to COVID issued by government bureaucrats, either with scientific training or at the recommendation/direction of scientists engaged by the government. Now think back to the warnings of President Eisenhower, or as we should perhaps be calling him from now on, President Nostradamus. Next topic. There are no Nostradamuses on Earth Day. Wait, was that the correct plural of Nostradamus? Nostradamuses? Nostradami? Nostradamen? No, somebody on the left on Twitter would object to that. Nostrada women? No, the left would say that's a gender binary, so it's inappropriate. Nostradamus X? No, that's not clearly plural. Oh, forget about it. We've had a President Nostradamus, but there was no equivalent of Nostradamus on Earth Day. But why? Why do I say that? Well, think about it. We have these days, and everybody makes their predictions in connection with them, and the press covers them if they meet the narrative. And the narrative isn't chosen based on facts. It's chosen based on the political leanings of the press and the desire to get clicks. And given that the political leanings of the press match almost perfectly with nearly all of the rest of the media, as well as academia and the vast majority of the people with elevated voices in society, there's virtually nobody left to push back effectively. So accuracy doesn't make it anywhere near the top of the list when choosing the predictions. If they're dead wrong, who's going to publicize the fact that they were dead wrong when it becomes clear years later? Sure, you can find out about it if you dig, but you have to dig a bit, and the multiple prior mistakes are never going to be connected with the current Earth Day predictions, because that would break with the narrative. If you listen to this podcast going way back, you'd know that I've hammered the book The Population Bomb that was all the rage in my youth, with its preaching of imminent starvation across the planet from an explosion of overpopulation. Its author, Paul Ehrlich, was celebrated on virtually every talk show and in every newspaper you could find. Ehrlich was a professor of biology at the prestigious Stanford University, and his book, The Population Bomb, released in 1968, began with this line seemingly straight out of a Hollywood script, predicting an almost unimaginable dystopian future. Quote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over." Close quote. Since his book has proven so spectacularly wrong, Ehrlich has asserted that what are described as predictions from the book aren't really predictions, but rather simply scenarios. In that respect, he makes me think that Paul Ehrlich was just an earlier iteration of Dr. Anthony Fauci. But even Dr. Fauci hasn't run with a line quite as absurd as Ehrlich talking about mass starvation in London. In 1971, Ehrlich predicted, quote, "By the year 2000, the United Kingdom will be simply a small group of impoverished islands inhabited by some 70 million hungry people." Close quote. Rather than starving, in reality, the United Kingdom is actually suffering from the problem with which we are all too familiar. In reality, rather than a Paul Ehrlich prediction, the United Kingdom is suffering from an obesity epidemic. Of course, I say that prediction about the UK was topped by this even more ridiculous one that, quote, "India couldn't possibly feed 200 million more people by 1980, close quote. Well, as it turns out, India is now a food exporter. In fact, India is the world's biggest exporter of rice. So much for not being able to feed 200 million more people. Why am I harping on Paul Ehrlich? After all, I've done it before. The extent to which he was wrong has been finally acknowledged by many. Even the BBC ran a segment exposing him. He even acknowledged at one point that he exaggerated for effect. Talk about similarities to Anthony Fauci. And most recently, the American Spectator ran an article on June 28 by Stephen Moore and David M. Simon entitled "The Population Bomb Doomsday Scam." Subtitled, "The narrative we've been force-fed for decades is being abandoned by its strictest adherents." The authors note that even the New York Times has acknowledged that the mortally feared, quote, population bomb, close quote, has turned into a global, quote, population bust, close quote. As the authors put it, quote, "The greatest environmental/demographic scare of the second half of the 20th century, overpopulation, is now officially conceded to have been a monumental fraud," close quote. They go further, quote, "To appreciate what an embarrassing reversal this is for the green movement, consider that 40 to 50 years ago, nearly all the scientists, policymakers, U.S. government agencies, and experts at the United Nations told us that rampaging population growth would lead to a Malthusian doomsday, with the world in our lifetimes running out of food, energy, and nearly everything else. If ever there was an ironclad, quote, scientific consensus, close quote, this was it, close quote." And as you would expect based on that description, the over-the-top, attention-getting, but ultimately incredibly wrong predictions from the scientific and government communities didn't just come from Paul Ehrlich. As the authors point out, U.S. government agronomist William Paddock and Foreign Service officer Paul Paddock wrote in 1967 in their book Famine 1975, and the 1975, by the way, is followed by an exclamation point, that starvation would be so overwhelming that India and Egypt would be subjected to triage and ultimately abandoned as, quote, can't be saved, close quote. Try to wrap your head around how incredibly wrong they were when you look just for a moment at the overwhelming economic growth of India. It has become an agricultural powerhouse as a rice exporter and an undeniable business and technological powerhouse. Pretty shocking for a country to somehow manage to accomplish such astounding success when it was supposed to be starving itself into oblivion. And the prognosticating failures didn't stop there. The UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific issued their prognostication, quote, 500 million starvation deaths in Asia between 1980 and 2025, close quote. The reality, as the authors in the American Spectator article note, the prediction was off by roughly 99%. Worldwide famine deaths decreased from an annual average of over 1.6 million in the 1960s to less than 40,000 since 2010. Even without limiting it to Asia and instead looking at the entire world, from 1980 through 2016, total famine deaths were less than 6 million, compared to the 500 million predicted for 1980 through 2025 for Asia alone. And the penalty that was paid for trusting the experts, for following the bad advice, for believing that they could predict the future, wasn't just worry and heartburn and having to listen to commentators drone on confidently about something of which they knew little. The penalty was much worse. Couples chose not to have kids because they were expecting a world overcome by starvation resulting from unsustainable population growth. And repressive governments around the world bought into the mania, some of which performed forced abortions and sterilizations, and China mandated a one-child policy. That same China, which now, apparently realizing the error of its prior restriction, has lifted the requirement and is now actually actively encouraging childbirth. But the prognosticating failures of the scientists, the government bureaucrats, the supposed experts isn't limited to predictions of famine resulting from population growth. Check out some of the predictions made in conjunction with the first Earth Day in 1970, and you'll find a plethora of ridiculous forecasts of mass starvation. But you'll also find predictions of other doomsday scenarios. Read the American Enterprise Institute's article by Mark Perry dated April 22, 2020, entitled 18 Spectacularly Wrong Predictions Made Around the Time of the First Earth Day in 1970. Expect more this year. For example, in January 1970, Life magazine reported that, quote, Scientists have solid experimental and theoretical evidence to support the following predictions. In a decade, urban dwellers will have to wear gas masks to survive air pollution. By 1985, air pollution will reduce the amount of sunlight reaching Earth by 1/2. Close quote. As I think back to those sunburns when I was fishing and didn't sufficiently frequently reapply that Elmer's glue-like PSF 1 trillion sunscreen I use, I guess I must have been hallucinating and wasn't sunburned at all. I'm not even sure why I wore my sunglasses, which border on welding goggles, when I was fishing the blistering South Florida saltwater backcountry. According to the expert predictions from 1970, it must have actually been a gray, overcast day straight out of Victorian London. Who knew? Check this one out from ecologist Kenneth Watt. Quote, "At the present rate of nitrogen buildup, it's only a matter of time before life will be filtered out of the atmosphere and none of our land will be usable." Close quote. It's been 51 years since that ridiculous prediction. How ridiculous? Just take a drive from Cincinnati to Columbus near harvest time. The corn will be so tall that you'd have to be an NBA center to have even a shot at looking over it as you walk across the fields. Or this one, also from ecologist Kenneth Watt. Quote, "By the year 2000, if present trends continue, we will be using up crude oil at such a rate that there won't be any more crude oil. You'll drive up to the pump and say, 'Fill her up, buddy,' and he'll say, 'I'm very sorry, there isn't any.'" Close quote. As the authors point out, global oil production in 2018 and 2019 was over 82 million barrels per day in each year, roughly 50% higher than the 55.7 million barrels per day annually when the first Earth Day was held. So much for running out of oil by the year 2000. And the hits just keep on coming, including predictions of running out of copper just after the year 2000, with lead, zinc, tin, gold, and silver being used up by 1990. And finally, to put this all in perspective, as we're being told for the umpteenth time that we're on the cusp of the point of no return to address global warming to prevent apocalyptic climate change, there's this reminder from the authors of what the experts were saying around that first Earth Day. Kenneth Watt warned about an impending ice age when he declared, quote, "The world has been chilling sharply for about 20 years. If present trends continue, the world will be about 4 degrees colder for the global mean temperature in 1990, but 11 degrees colder in the year 2000. This is about twice what it would take to put us into an ice age." Close quote. Think about that when you hear those confident predictions from scientists, government bureaucrats, and the ever-present talking heads on cable TV spouting off about an impending doomsday from predicted planet warming. Now is the time when I typically confidently predict when you'll hear the next episode of the Political Spirits podcast. But for the time being, I'm not going to be able to quite so confidently make that prediction. I will be back, and it may be next week, but I have some conflicts going on which could delay the next episode, just as they delayed this episode. So I will be back, and it may be next week. And when I am back with the next episode, please be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well. And like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.